Billionaire CEO Xander Brandy spots his ex, Flora, waiting for an Uber with three identical 6-year-old boys, his sons. Shocked, he realizes he never knew they existed. As the car drives away, Xander breaks down in tears, overwhelmed by the family he lost. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. Enjoy the story and watch till the end as it'll shock you. The hot July sun pounded down on Boston, turning the streets into a furnace of frustration and heat. The city's busy roads were choked with honking cars, and the drivers seemed to grow more impatient as time stretched on. Among all the chaos, a sleek black Bentley caught the eye, but it wasn't the car's luxury that stood out. It was the man stepping out of the back seat, Xander Brandy, the 38-year-old CEO of Brandy Innovations, one of America's youngest self-made billionaires. As Xander adjusted his crisp Italian suit, he looked around at the familiar streets of his hometown, feeling out of place. 6 years of living abroad, building his empire in Asia, had transformed him from a successful entrepreneur into a global business giant. His face, once youthful, now had the lines of authority and experience, a reflection of a man who had learned to bend the world to his will. "I'll continue on foot," Xander said casually to his driver, dismissing him with a wave. The driver hesitated, worried about the mile-long distance ahead, but Xander was determined. He needed to stretch his legs after the long flight and the relentless pressure of his schedule. As Xander walked down the bustling streets of Boston, his mind was elsewhere, on meetings, pitches, and billion-dollar deals. The city seemed more frantic than he remembered, with new skyscrapers popping up and old buildings replaced. But it wasn't until he turned a corner to avoid a crowded intersection that something caught his attention. A scene outside a Walmart drew him in. A woman in her 30s was trying to wrangle 3 energetic boys, each about 6 years old, as they darted around her. "Brandon, don't run. Ethan, give him back his action figure. Cal son, stay close." The voice. Xander froze. It was a voice he hadn't heard in years but would recognize anywhere. A voice that sent his heart racing, "Flora." His feet were glued to the sidewalk. He didn't want to move, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. As he watched the 3 boys, something stirred inside him. A terrifying realization slowly began to form. Their faces, those green eyes, that jawline, his. The way one of them tilted his head in curiosity, just like he did during business meetings. Before he could think, Xander took a step forward, then another, and another. He was suddenly right there, just feet away from Flora and the 3 boys. One of the boys noticed him first. "Mom, who's that man in the suit looking at us?" Flora's eyes widened as she looked up, and Xander could see all the emotions flash across her face: surprise, pain, anger, and fear. "Xander?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the noise of the city. Xander's throat tightened. "Flora, these children." Before he could finish, the light changed, and people began moving around them, breaking the tension. Flora quickly gathered the boys and started hustling them toward the parking lot. "We need to go," she said, her voice strained. Xander's mind raced. "Please, can we talk?" he called out, his voice desperate. Flora hesitated, reached into her purse, and scribbled something on a receipt. "Tomorrow, noon. Brewster's Cafe on Maple Street," she said quickly, then turned and walked away, leaving Xander standing there, his world shattered. "They're mine," he whispered to himself. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Those 3 boys, his eyes, his jawline. The timing, 6 years after he had left. The way Flora had looked at him, a mixture of defensiveness and resignation. It was too much to process. He stood there, barely noticing the rain as it began to fall in heavy drops, soaking his suit. Everything that had once mattered, his empire, his success, suddenly seemed insignificant. In an instant, his whole world had changed. He was a father to 3 children he didn't know existed. The night dragged on in a blur. Xander paced his penthouse, his mind spinning with questions. By morning, he was exhausted, his eyes bloodshot from the sleepless night. When noon arrived, he was at Brewster's Cafe, his fingers nervously tapping on the coffee cup. He could barely sit still, his heart racing every time the door opened. At precisely 12 o'clock, she walked in, Flora Thomas. Still beautiful, but with a new edge to her. She paused for a moment, then walked confidently to his table. "You look terrible," she said, sitting down. "Hello to you too, Flora," Xander said, trying to smile. The years of silence between them felt like a weight on his chest. "The boys," Xander said quietly, his voice trembling. "They're mine, aren't they?" Flora studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, Xander. Brandon, Ethan, and Calsun are your sons." "Our sons." The words hit Xander like a wave. He had known, of course, but hearing it made everything real. "I'm sorry," he stammered, but Flora gave a bitter laugh. "I think you know how babies are made, Xander. Or have you forgotten our last night together before you left for Asia?" Memories of that night flooded Xander's mind, the passion, the promises for the future, everything they had dreamed of. "But why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice filled with regret. "I tried, Xander. I called you, emailed you, even went to your office, but you disappeared. You simply vanished from my life." Xander's shame hit him hard. He remembered those first months in Asia, how he'd ignored Flora's attempts to reach him. At the time, he had convinced himself it was for the best, that his career was the only thing that mattered. "I'm sorry," he repeated, the words hollow in the face of the pain he had caused. "Being sorry doesn't change the fact that I raised 3 children alone for 6 years, Flora's voice cracked. "It doesn't erase the sleepless nights, the struggles, the sacrifices. I want to meet them," Xander said suddenly, his voice filled with determination. "I want to be part of their lives." Flora's gaze was hard as she studied him. "It's not that simple. You can't just show up after 6 years and expect everything to be fine. Please, Flora. Give me a chance to make it right." Flora sighed, her expression softening just slightly. "Friday evening. Come to our house at 6 o'clock. But this will be on my terms. At my pace. And if I see this affecting the boys negatively, it's over. Understand?" "Yes," Xander said, his voice urgent. "Absolutely." Flora wrote her address on a napkin and slid it across the table. "The boys will have finished dinner by then. It'll just be a short visit." She stood to leave but paused at the door. "Don't thank me yet, Xander. For my boys, you're a stranger. For me, you're someone who hurt me deeply. It'll take time to rebuild any kind of trust." Found Xander pulling up to a modest 2-story house in Brighton. It was nothing like the luxury properties he was used to. The neighborhood was quiet, with children's bicycles scattered on lawns and family cars filling driveways. Xander felt out of place, his Bentley a glaring contrast to the homes around him. He checked his reflection one last time, straightened his button-down shirt, Flora had insisted on no suits, and took a deep breath. When Flora opened the door, she gave him a cool, practiced smile. "You're on time," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "The boys are in the living room," she added. "I've told them you're an old friend who just discovered you're their father." Xander nodded, his throat tight. As he followed Flora through the hallway, the sound of children's voices grew louder. And then there they were, 3 identical boys, sitting on the couch. "Boys," Flora said gently. "This is Xander Brandy. He's your father." An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. One of the boys, wearing a red shirt, stood up first. "I'm Brandon," he said, holding out his hand confidently. "I'm the oldest by 4 minutes." Xander smiled as he shook Brandon's hand. "It's very nice to meet you, Brandon." Another boy, in a blue shirt, approached cautiously. I'm Ethan. I'm in the middle. Are you really our dad? How come we never met you before? Xander was caught off guard by the question, but before he could answer, the third boy, wearing green, crossed his arms. He probably didn't want to meet us, the boy said, his face hardening into a scowl that Xander recognized from old photos of himself. That's why he never came before. Flora gently scolded Cal's son, remember what we talked about. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. Xander knelt in front of the boys, his heart heavy. Your mom is right. I made a big mistake by not being here. I didn't know about you until I saw you at the store. But that's no excuse. If I had known, I would have been here sooner. Cal's son didn't soften. Do you have other kids? He asked. No, Xander answered honestly. You three are my only children. Brandon, ever the icebreaker, pointed to the gift bags Xander had brought. Are those for us? As the evening progressed, the awkwardness began to fade. Brandon bombarded Xander with questions, Edmund quietly observed, and Cal's son kept his distance. But when Flora announced bedtime, Xander realized that 2 hours had passed in what felt like minutes. As he prepared to leave, Flora walked him to the door. It went better than I expected, she said, her voice softening. They're amazing, Flora, Xander said, his voice thick with emotion. You've done an incredible job raising them. Flora's expression softened just a little. Would you like to come to Brandon's baseball game tomorrow? 10 a.m. at Franklin Park. Xander nodded eagerly. I'll be there. As he drove back to his empty penthouse, his thoughts were consumed by 3 small faces. For the first time in years, spreadsheets and profit margins seemed insignificant. The rain was coming down in torrents, but Xander didn't move. He stood frozen in the downpour, his expensive suit quickly soaked through, as if he didn't even notice. Everything he had worked for, the deals, the power, the success, it all seemed to fade into nothingness in that moment. In the span of just a few minutes, his life had turned upside down. The man who had once conquered the world of business now stood, utterly lost, on a quiet street corner, his mind grappling with a truth he never saw coming. He was the father to 3 children he'd never known existed. The night felt like a blur. Xander walked the floor of his penthouse, up and down, his thoughts spiraling. He stared at the ceiling, then out at the Boston skyline, his mind racing. Hours seemed to stretch on forever. By the time morning came, he was barely able to recognize the man in the mirror. His face, usually sharp and clean-shaven, was now covered in a rough stubble, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. His usual confident look was replaced with a deep, overwhelming uncertainty. By 11:30 a.m., Xander was sitting at Brewster's Cafe, his fingers tapping anxiously on the coffee cup in front of him. His eyes kept darting to the door. Every time it opened, his heart leaped in his chest, the anticipation nearly unbearable. Then, at exactly 2 p.m., she walked in. Flora Thomas. She was still beautiful, but now there was something different about her, an air of quiet strength. Her eyes held more lines, deeper than before, and her steps were purposeful as she spotted him across the room. She hesitated for a brief moment, then made her way to his table. You look terrible, she said, her tone blunt, but not unkind. She sat down across from him without waiting for a response. Xander tried to smile, but it came out weak. Hello to you too, Flora. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with years of unspoken words. Then, after a long pause, Xander barely whispered, the boys, they're mine, aren't they? Flora studied him for a long moment, as though weighing his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. Yes, Xander. Brandon, Ethan, and Cal's son are your sons. Our sons. The words hit Xander like a punch to the gut. He had known it deep down, of course, but hearing her say it made everything painfully real. It was like the world he had built, the life he had fought for, suddenly lost its meaning. How? How could I have not known? The question escaped his lips before he could stop it. Flora let out a bitter laugh, a sound that caught Xander off guard. I think you know how babies are made, Xander. Or have you forgotten our last night together before you left for Asia? Memories flooded him, their last night together, the passion, the promises, the future they had dreamed of. But then he had left. Gone to Asia. And everything had changed. But why didn't you tell me? His voice cracked, almost pleading. I had a right to know. Flora's eyes narrowed, cold but steady. I tried, Xander. I called your cell 100 times. I sent emails, messages. I even went to your office here in Boston, but I was turned away. You disappeared from my life. You just vanished. Shame flooded through Xander like a wave. He remembered the early months in Asia, the emails and calls from Flora he had ignored. At the time, he had convinced himself that focusing on his career was more important than a long-distance relationship. But now, hearing her words, he couldn't shake the guilt. I'm sorry, he mumbled, but he knew those words were empty. They couldn't change anything. Sorry doesn't change the fact that I raised 3 kids alone for 6 years, Flora replied, her voice tight, quivering with the emotion she had held back for so long. It doesn't take away the sleepless nights, the struggles, the sacrifices. Xander's throat tightened. He knew he couldn't fix those 6 years, but he had to try. I want to meet them. I want to be part of their lives. Flora's gaze was sharp as she studied him, assessing every word he said. It's not that simple. You can't just show up after 6 years and expect everything to be okay. They've had their lives without you, Xander. You've been a stranger to them. Please, Flora, he begged. Give me a chance. I want to make things right. She looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed, the weight of everything between them settling in the air. Friday evening. Come to our house at 6 p.m. But this will be on my terms, at my pace. And if I see this affecting the boys in any way, it's over. Understand? Yes, Xander said quickly, relief flooding him. Absolutely. Whatever you need. Flora wrote her address on a napkin and slid it across the table. The boys will have finished dinner by then. It'll just be a short visit for you to meet them. As she stood to leave, Xander called after her. Flora, thank you. She paused, looking back at him with eyes that seemed to see right through him. Don't thank me yet, Xander. For my boys, you're a stranger. And for me? You're someone who hurt me deeply. It'll take time to rebuild any trust between us. The drive to Flora's house felt like it took an eternity. Xander's usual confidence was gone, replaced with an overwhelming sense of discomfort. He parked his Bentley along the curb at precisely 5:55 p.m. on Friday, his heart racing in his chest. The modest 2-story house in Brighton stood in stark contrast to the luxury he was used to. This was a middle-class neighborhood, families with kids, bicycles on lawns, family cars parked in driveways. For a moment, Xander felt completely out of place. He glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror and straightened his shirt, a simple button-down, as Flora had requested. No suits. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched the 3 gift bags he had brought. Each contained a model airplane, something Flora had mentioned the boys liked. He had spent hours choosing the perfect presents, hoping they'd be a good way to introduce himself. The doorbell rang, its cheerful sound a sharp contrast to the storm brewing inside of him. When Flora opened the door, she gave him a look that was hard to read. Her face was calm, almost professional. You're on time, she remarked, stepping aside to let him in. The boys are in the living room, she added, her tone cool but not unkind. The rain poured down in sheets, but Xander didn't move an inch. His expensive suit was quickly soaked, but he didn't notice. It was as if the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside his mind. Everything he had worked for, the deals, the business victories, the life he'd built, suddenly felt meaningless. In just a few moments, his whole world had shifted. The man who had spent years dominating the business world now stood on a quiet street corner, lost, overwhelmed by the shocking truth. He was a father to 3 children he didn't even know existed. The night that followed was a blur. Xander paced back and forth in his penthouse, unable to shake the thoughts racing through his head. He stared at the ceiling, then looked out over the Boston skyline. Hours dragged on, but he couldn't find any peace. When morning finally came, he looked in the mirror. He barely recognized himself. His face was unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, and the usual confident expression he wore was replaced with confusion and uncertainty. By 11:30 a.m., Xander was sitting at Brewster's Cafe, his fingers tapping nervously on the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. Every time the door opened, his heart jumped into his throat. Then, at exactly 2 p.m., she walked in. Flora Thomas. She was still beautiful, but there was something different about her now. Her eyes had a new sharpness to them, and the lines around them spoke of years of strength and determination. As soon as she saw him, she hesitated for just a moment before walking purposefully toward his table. "You look terrible," she said as she sat down. Xander tried to force a smile. "Hello to you too, Flora." An awkward silence settled between them, filled with years of unspoken words. After a long moment, Xander whispered, barely audible, "The boys, they're mine, aren't they?" Flora studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, Xander. Brandon, Ethan, and Cal's son are your sons." "Our sons." The words hit Xander hard, like a punch to the chest. He had known, deep down, that this moment was coming, but hearing her say it out loud made everything real in a way he hadn't been prepared for. His mind raced. How? He opened his mouth to ask, but the words came out clumsy, regretful. How? Flora let out a bitter laugh, and Xander felt a pang in his chest. "I think you know how babies are made, Xander. Or have you forgotten our last night together before you left for Asia?" A flood of memories hit him, his last night with Flora, the promises, the hopes they shared for a future together. But he had left. Gone to Asia. And everything had changed. "But why didn't you tell me?" Xander's voice broke. "I had a right to know." Flora's eyes hardened. "I tried to tell you, Xander. I called your phone countless times. I sent emails, messages. I even showed up at your office here in Boston, but I was turned away. You just disappeared from my life." Shame washed over Xander. He remembered how, in those first months in Asia, he had ignored Flora's attempts to reach him. He had told himself it was for the best, he had to focus on his career, he couldn't be distracted by a long-distance relationship. But now, hearing Flora's words, he realized how wrong he had been. I'm sorry," he muttered, but he knew it was not enough. Those words could never undo the years of pain. "Sorry doesn't change the fact that I raised 3 kids alone for 6 years, Flora said, her voice trembling. "It doesn't take away the sleepless nights, the financial struggles, the sacrifices." Xander's throat tightened. How could he make up for all that time? All the moments he had missed? He had no idea, but he knew he had to try. "I want to meet them," he said suddenly. "I want to be part of their lives." Flora looked at him for a long, tense moment, studying his face, trying to read the sincerity in his words. Finally, she sighed. "It's not that simple, Xander. You can't just walk into their lives after 6 years and expect everything to be fine. They've been fine without you. Please, Flora," Xander begged. "Give me a chance. Let me make things right." She looked at him for a moment longer, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded, slowly. Friday evening. Come to our house at 6 p.m. But this will be on my terms. At my pace. And if I see this affecting the boys negatively, it's over. Understand? Xander nodded quickly, relief flooding through him. Yes. Absolutely. Whatever you say. Flora wrote her address on a napkin and slid it across the table. The boys will have finished dinner by then. It'll be a short visit for you to meet them. As she stood to leave, Xander called after her. Flora, thank you. She paused at the door, looking back at him with a mixture of sadness and wariness. Don't thank me yet, Xander. For my boys, you're a stranger. And for me? You're someone who hurt me deeply. It's going to take time to rebuild any kind of trust. Xander sat there, the weight of her words settling in his chest. When Friday came, Xander found himself parked outside a modest two-story house in Brighton. It looked nothing like the luxurious homes he was used to. This was a middle-class neighborhood, where children's bicycles were left on front lawns and family cars filled driveways. Xander felt out of place as he checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. He straightened his shirt. A simple button-down, as Flora had specifically asked for no suits, and took a deep breath. In his hands, he clutched 3 identical gift bags. Each one contained a model airplane, something the boys, according to Flora, were fascinated with. He hoped it would be a good way to introduce himself, to show that he was trying. At precisely 5:55 p.m., he rang the doorbell. The sound of it seemed too cheerful for the anxiety that was churning inside him. When the door opened, Flora stood there, her face a calm mask, as if nothing was at stake. You're on time, she said, stepping aside to let him in. The boys are in the living room, she added, her voice even, neutral. The ice cream in front of Xander slowly melted, untouched, as Brandon's innocent question shattered the calm. Are you going to live with us now? The question landed like a bomb, leaving a tense silence in its wake. Both Xander and Flora exchanged uneasy looks, their eyes flicking nervously. Well, no, Xander said after a long pause, his voice soft but firm. I have my own place, but I'd like to spend a lot of time with all of you, if that's okay. Brandon didn't let up. Every day? Xander hesitated, unsure of how to answer. Before he could speak, Edmund chimed in, his voice matter-of-fact. Well, Mom works a lot. Sometimes 2 jobs. Xander looked over at Flora, raising an eyebrow. Flora's cheeks flushed, a quiet embarrassment creeping over her face. She shrugged slightly, a small sign of resignation. Medical billing during the day, online classes at night. Single motherhood isn't cheap, she explained quietly. It was the first time Xander truly understood the weight Flora had carried all these years. As his mind started to race with thoughts of the expenses she had shouldered alone, private school tuition, college funds, healthcare, everything, it made him feel even more distant from the world he had built, one that had only ever focused on work and success. He thought about how, in his pursuit of billions, he'd missed all of this. As they walked back to the parking lot, Flora pulled Xander aside. They have a school concert next Friday evening. All 3 of them are performing. Xander's heart squeezed. I'll be there, he said without a second thought. It starts at 6:30 sharp, Flora reminded him, her voice serious. Please don't be late. Especially Calsun. He's playing piano. Xander's mind spun for a moment. He had a high-stakes business meeting that Friday, something crucial. But suddenly, it felt trivial, insignificant compared to Coulson's recital. A child's piano performance was now his top priority. Without thinking, Xander pulled out his phone. Cancel my Tokyo trip for next week, he told his assistant, his voice sharp. And move Friday's board meeting to lunch. I have an appointment at 6:30 that I can't miss. For the first time, Xander was making his business revolve around his personal life. That thought felt foreign but right. The week passed quickly, and Xander found himself juggling meetings and calls, all while making time for his sons. He visited them twice, once for a quick dinner and another time to help with homework. Each time, he saw a little more of who they were. Brandon was outgoing, adventurous. Edmund was quiet but sharp, a thinker. Calson remained distant, hesitant, his talents hidden behind walls of self-protection. Friday afternoon, Xander sat in his downtown office, anxiously watching the time during a video conference with international investors. The meeting was supposed to end at 5 p.m., giving him more than enough time to make it to the concert by 6:30. But as the conference continued, his mind kept drifting to the time. As you can see, gentlemen, Xander said, clicking through his presentation, the Q3 projections are extremely favorable. We're looking at a 22% growth in the Asian markets alone. He checked his watch again, tension mounting in his chest. His phone buzzed quietly on the desk. A text from Flora, reminder, concert starts 6:30 sharp. Boys are nervous. Xander quickly replied with a thumbs-up emoji, a small thing, but it was a break from his usual professional demeanor. He caught Miranda, his assistant, glancing at him with a raised eyebrow, but she said nothing and kept taking notes. At exactly 4:52 p.m., just as Xander was about to wrap up, a voice from across the table interrupted him. Before we adjourn, Mr. Brandy, one of the investors from Singapore said, raising his hand. I have serious concerns about the supply chain disruptions in Malaysia. Perhaps we could extend our discussion? Xander felt a knot form in his stomach. I'd be happy to address those concerns, Mr. Tan, but I'm afraid I have a prior commitment at 6:30 that I cannot reschedule. Miranda's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Xander Brandy never cut meetings short, especially for personal reasons. Mr. Tan wasn't pleased. This is a $300 million commitment we're discussing, Mr. Brandy. Surely whatever dinner reservation you have can wait. Before Xander could respond, his phone began ringing. Flora again. He excused himself briefly, holding up a hand to apologize. He answered the phone quickly. Xander, it's an emergency. Flora's voice was tight, filled with panic. Edmund fell at recess. We're at Massachusetts General. They think his arm might be broken. Everything inside Xander froze. I'll be right there, he said, barely able to breathe. Without another word, he hung up and turned to the video conference. Gentlemen, I apologize, he said, his voice strained. I have a family emergency. My son is in the hospital. Without waiting for any further responses, Xander cut the meeting short and rushed toward the elevator, barking instructions to Miranda to reschedule the remaining meetings. 20 minutes later, Xander ran through the hospital entrance, his tie skewed and his heart pounding. He found Flora in the pediatric waiting area, her face pale with worry. Brandon and Calson sat quietly beside her, but neither looked up as he approached. Where is he? Is he okay? Xander demanded, breathless. Flora glanced up at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. He's getting an X-ray. The doctor thinks it's just a fracture, not a break. Xander felt his body sag with relief. He collapsed into a chair beside Calson, who was staring down at his shoes, avoiding eye contact. What happened? Xander asked, his voice gentler now. Brandon looked up at him, his voice soft but clear. He fell from the monkey bars. Calson added, his voice almost a whisper, there was blood. He's going to miss his violin solo. The words cut through the tension in the room like a knife. Edmund had worked so hard for that solo. Xander felt the weight of those words, the implied accusation hanging in the air. Edmund was going to miss his performance, just like everyone expected Xander to miss it too. A full hour passed before Edmund was brought out of the X-ray room, his arm in a blue cast. But even in the midst of his pain, when his eyes landed on his father, he smiled. The tears that had been building in Xander's eyes were finally free to fall. "You came," Coulson's soft voice broke through the air as Xander knelt beside him, gently inspecting the new cast on his arm. "Of course, I came," Xander replied quietly, his eyes filled with something deep as he looked at the boy. "You're my son." The drive home was a mix of emotions. Ethan, groggy and drifting from the effects of the pain medication, sat quietly in the back seat of Flora's car. Xander followed in his Bentley, but his mind was anything but calm. His phone rang incessantly, non-stop calls from Singapore, but Xander silenced it, not even pausing to check who it was. Later that evening, as Xander helped Flora tuck the exhausted boys into bed, a text from his assistant blinked onto his phone screen. "Mr. Tan has concerns about your commitment to the project." The message seemed to echo in his mind, but Xander didn't give it more than a passing thought. Right now, his focus was on the boys, on being there for them in a way he had never been before. At the office the next day, Xander found himself discussing a groundbreaking new design with an architect. "This is revolutionary, Mr. Brandy," the architect said, looking stunned. "But the cost, that's irrelevant, right?" Xander smiled, finishing the thought. "Draw up preliminary plans for Monday," he said, his voice clear and confident. But even as he spoke, his thoughts drifted. On his drive home, Xander called his old college roommate, Mark, hoping for some advice. Mark was a father of 4, and Xander thought he might know how to balance family and work. "Mark, how do you do it? Balance everything?" Mark laughed, a low chuckle that came from experience. "You don't balance it, Xander. Balance means equal weight. It's not like that. You prioritize. Sometimes work wins, sometimes family wins. But if family doesn't win most of the time, you've already lost." Xander leaned back in his car seat, Mark's words echoing in his head. When he arrived at his penthouse, the minimalist design that had always seemed so sleek and sophisticated now felt cold and empty. For the first time, Xander felt the vast space of his penthouse was hollow. Without thinking, he grabbed his phone and ordered 3 identical desk frames. Tomorrow, after the recital, he'd ask Flora for pictures of the boys to fill them. As he lay in bed that night, Xander realized something that made him uneasy. He was anxious, not about the board's reaction to his new initiatives or the next big deal. No, for the first time, their approval felt secondary. Tomorrow, at 6:30, he'd be sitting front row at an elementary school recital, watching his son play piano. That was the moment that mattered now. It was strange, but clear. Coulson's smile at that recital meant more than anything else ever had. The next morning, at 5 a.m., Xander's phone blared with a notification. A crisis had emerged in the Singapore negotiations and demanded immediate attention. Xander sprang into action, working from his home office, rescheduling meetings and shifting responsibilities so that his afternoon would be free for his son's recital. At 11 a.m., his intercom buzzed. It was Richard, the board chairman, showing up unannounced. "Richard," Xander greeted, trying to mask his surprise. "This is unexpected." Richard wasted no time. "What's this I hear about restructuring the whole company? Rumors are flying that you're thinking of stepping down." Xander remained calm but firm. "I'm implementing changes to create a healthier work environment." Richard was skeptical. "Xander, I understand the shock, but making rash decisions that could affect thousands of employees." "There's nothing rash about it," Xander cut in. "I've thought this through." Richard was unimpressed. "In what, 2 weeks? You've spent 6 years building up the company's presence in Asia, and now you're willing to throw it all away, for what? For your sons?" Xander looked him square in the eye. "Yes. For my sons." Richard didn't say anything for a long moment, studying Xander carefully. "The board meeting on Monday will be contentious," he finally said. "You need to be prepared." Xander didn't hesitate. "I'll be there with a complete proposal." Richard nodded and left, but before he went, Xander made one last call to his Singapore team, setting clear boundaries. No contact between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. tonight, under any circumstances. At 4:30 p.m., Xander surprised his assistant, Miranda, by leaving the office early with a bouquet of flowers. "Cancel anything else that comes up. Family priority," he instructed. Arriving at the elementary school auditorium half an hour early, Xander found a front row seat, his heart already racing. The space was quickly filling with parents, some holding cameras, others trying to calm their fidgeting younger children. When Flora arrived with Brandon and Ethan, she seemed surprised to see Xander already sitting down. "You're early," she said, her voice soft but amused, as the boys sat beside him. "I wouldn't miss this," Xander replied simply, his voice steady. When the curtain rose, Xander's eyes immediately locked on Calsun. The boy looked small behind the grand piano, but there was a quiet intensity in his gaze. Calsun searched the audience, and when his eyes found Xander, they widened slightly. Xander couldn't help himself, he gave him a thumbs up. Then, something magical happened, a real, genuine smile spread across Calsun's face. The smile was everything. It transformed Calsun's usually serious expression, and for the first time, Xander felt like they were connecting. Then Calsun's fingers touched the piano keys, and Xander's entire world narrowed to that moment, to that child, to the music. Calsun played beautifully. His technique was remarkable for his age, and as Xander listened, pride welled up in his chest. He wasn't just proud of Calsun, he was overwhelmed with emotions, pride, love, and even regret for the years he'd missed. It was all there, tangled together. When the performance ended, Xander was the first to rise to his feet, applauding with unrestrained joy. For the first time in a long time, Xander felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The applause was deafening as Calsun finished his piano piece. His eyes searched the crowd, and when they landed on Xander, a smile spread across his face that made Xander's heart swell. It wasn't just a smile, it was a sign of everything that had changed in their lives, a moment that meant more than any deal or success ever could. After the performance, families scattered into the crowded hallway, chatting and congratulating their kids. Calsun, though, hesitated, walking toward Xander with uncertainty in his eyes. "Did you really like it?" he asked, his voice small, almost nervous. Xander knelt to Calsun's level, the weight of the moment settling in. "I thought it was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He handed Calsun the flowers he'd brought for him, and Calsun took them with a quiet nod, his pleasure barely concealed behind a wall of seriousness. "I practiced a lot," Calsun admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I could tell," Xander said, his words warm with admiration. "You're incredibly talented." Flora watched this exchange, a quiet hope flickering in her eyes as she observed the way Xander spoke to Calsun, the way Calsun looked at him. Meanwhile, Brandon and Edmund eagerly pulled Xander's attention toward the art display down the hall. As Xander allowed himself to be led by the boys, his phone remained silent in his pocket. For the first time in his life, Xander Brandy, the relentless businessman, was completely present in a moment that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with connecting to the people who truly mattered. Later, as Xander helped Flora load the boys into her car, she studied him thoughtfully. "Something's different about you tonight," she remarked, her voice curious. Xander gave her a smile, one that was calm and certain. "I made a choice today, Flora. The right one." He didn't explain further, but as he watched Flora drive away with the boys, he felt a sense of peace, a certainty about his new direction that settled deep in his bones. The upcoming board meeting would be challenging, no doubt, but tonight had confirmed what he had already known in his heart, he was finally choosing what truly mattered. The next morning, the doorbell rang, cutting through the Saturday morning cartoon marathon that had the triplets glued to the TV. Flora, up to her elbows in pancake batter, called out, "Can you get that, Brandon?" Brandon eagerly dashed to the door, expecting Xander, who had promised to take them to the park. But instead of Xander, he found an older couple standing there with suitcases in hand. "Grandma!" "Grandpa!" Brandon shouted with excitement. Flora froze, pancake batter dripping onto the floor. Surprise visits from her parents were usually a welcome treat, but today, of all days, it felt like the last thing she needed. She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried to the door. "Mom! Dad," she said, her voice a mix of surprise and concern. "You didn't tell me you were coming." Her mother laughed, already being mobbed by the excited boys. "Thomas had a conference in Boston cancelled, so we thought we'd drive up from Providence." Flora's father kissed her cheek. "You look tired, sweetheart. Everything okay?" Before Flora could answer, the unmistakable sound of a luxury car pulling up outside grabbed everyone's attention. Xander stepped out of his Bentley, looking casual yet impeccable in designer jeans and a polo shirt. "Who's that?" her father asked, his protective instincts immediately kicking in. "That's our dad," Brandon announced proudly, rushing outside. The silence that followed was thick. Flora's parents exchanged a look, stunned. Flora closed her eyes for a moment, summoning strength for what she knew was coming, the inevitable confrontation. "Your father," her mother repeated, disbelief thick in her voice. By the time Xander reached the door, his confident stride faltered. The icy stares of Flora's parents met him head-on. He had seen their faces in photos, had heard stories, but now, standing before them, he felt the full weight of their judgment. "Mr. and Mrs. Thomas," Xander said, extending his hand, though the warmth he tried to project was met with coldness. Thomas shook his hand firmly, almost too firmly. "I'm Xander Brandy," Xander said, trying to sound as composed as ever. "Oh, we know exactly who you are," Thomas replied, his voice laced with disdain. "The man who abandoned our daughter 6 years ago." The words hung in the air, and an uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Ethan, always practical, broke it with a quiet observation. "I don't think we'll all fit in Dad's car for the park now." An hour later, the adults sat in strained silence around the kitchen table, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them as the boys played outside. Flora had explained the recent developments, though her parents remained skeptical. "So, you just happened to spot them at Walmart and suddenly decided to become Father of the Year?" Thomas asked, his arms crossed as he studied Xander. Xander met his gaze steadily, undeterred by the skepticism in Thomas's voice. "I understand your skepticism, sir. I don't deserve an easy welcome into their lives. But I'm here now." "No, you don't," Ellen Thomas agreed, her tone hard. "Our daughter worked 2 jobs while taking night classes to provide for these boys." "Where were you? Building an empire?" "That meant nothing," Xander replied honestly, his voice quiet but firm. "I didn't know about the boys, but that's no excuse. I should have answered Flora's calls." Thomas snorted, unconvinced. "He's really trying, Dad," Flora said softly, trying to soften the tension. "Trying?" Thomas scoffed. "Parenthood isn't a corporate project you can dabble in when it's convenient, young man." "I know that now," Xander admitted, his voice steady. "I'm making major changes at my company to prioritize family. I've even begun plans for a new corporate campus designed around work-life balance." Big promises from a man who had always put business first, Thomas thought, clearly unconvinced. The conversation seemed destined to spiral further when Edmund unexpectedly entered the room, standing at the doorway, looking at his grandfather. "Grandpa," he said quietly, his voice unexpectedly strong. "Dad helped me with my science project about constellations. We stayed up really late working on it, even though he had an important meeting the next day." The simple words, coming from the normally quiet Ethan, were a quiet testament to the change in Xander, to the effort he had been putting in, to the new man he was becoming. It wasn't much, but to Xander, it was everything. The air was thick with a quiet tension as the boys continued to share their excitement about the weekend's events. Cal's son, the usually reserved one, caught everyone by surprise when he casually added, "And he came to my baseball game." Brandon, appearing behind his brother, jumped in with an eager grin. "And Coulson's recital too." Xander felt a wave of emotion wash over him, surprised that the boys had noticed all the little changes he had been making. Cal's son, with a look of pride, confirmed, he missed meetings for that. Xander's phone kept ringing, but he didn't answer. He simply looked at the boys, his heart tightening. He hadn't realized just how much these small decisions, these efforts, had begun to matter to them. Thomas, watching the scene unfold, studied his grandsons for a moment, then turned his gaze to Xander. His eyes softened just a fraction, a shift that didn't go unnoticed by Xander. "They seem to think you're making an effort," Thomas said, his tone less cold than before. "I am, sir," Xander replied without hesitation. "And I'll continue to every day, whether I have your approval or not." Later, as the group made their way to the park, the boys, now fully comfortable with their father, insisted that both their grandparents and Xander join them. Thomas fell into step beside Xander, his tone low but serious. "I'll be watching you closely, Brandy," he warned quietly. Xander didn't flinch, his voice steady as he replied, "I'd expect nothing less." He added after a pause, "They deserve a grandfather who protects them fiercely." Thomas's eyes widened slightly at the sincerity in Xander's voice, perhaps for the first time realizing that the wealthy businessman might care about something beyond his career and fortune. Ahead of them, the boys were laughing, their identical heads bobbing in excitement as they ran along the sidewalk, oblivious to the silent, complex dynamic between their elders. They were just kids, caught in the simple joy of a perfect afternoon, unaware of how their presence had already started to change their father's life forever. By Sunday morning, the tension from the previous day with Flora's parents had begun to ease. Xander found himself sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by Legos and 3 increasingly comfortable boys. Despite the lingering watchful eye of Thomas from his armchair, the atmosphere was light. The boys had started to accept Xander in ways he never expected, and he was slowly starting to feel like he belonged. "Dad, can you help me with this spaceship?" Brandon asked, pushing a half-constructed model toward him. "Sure, buddy," Xander replied, his voice warm as he carefully picked up the colorful instruction booklet. Business documents were usually filled with numbers, strategies, and spreadsheets, but now, he approached this simple task with the same level of focus he'd reserved for a billion-dollar deal. The work might have been different, but the dedication was the same. From the kitchen doorway, Flora and her mother, Ellen, observed the scene. The 2 women exchanged glances, each with a different expression. Ellen, ever cautious, watched Xander closely, while Flora's eyes were filled with a quiet, growing hope. "He seems different from how you described him," Ellen whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. Flora nodded, her voice soft. "He is different. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the workaholic businessman to come back." She glanced at Xander, who was now helping Cal's son with a tricky Lego tower while simultaneously answering Ethan's curious questions about rockets. "But then, I see this. I see him with the boys, and it's not the same. How are they handling all this?" Ellen asked, her voice filled with concern. "Better than I expected," Flora admitted. "Especially Cal's son. He was so closed off at first, but now..." As if on cue, Coulson's serious face melted into laughter, the sound rare and precious. It was the kind of laughter Flora hadn't heard in a long time. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Mom, I never thought they'd have this, a father who actually shows up." The morning flowed into lunch preparations, with Xander offering to grill in the backyard. Thomas reluctantly joined him, ostensibly to ensure Xander didn't burn the hamburgers, but it was clear there was something more to this. "My daughter says you're making changes at your company," Thomas remarked, watching Xander carefully as he arranged the patties on the grill. Xander nodded. Tomorrow, I present my plan to the board, a complete restructuring to prioritize family-friendly policies. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Risky move in your position. Necessary one, Xander replied. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about parenthood not being a corporate project. He flipped a burger with surprising skill. You were right. It's not. It's much more important. Thomas studied Xander, his mind wrestling to reconcile the man before him with the ruthless businessman he had painted him to be over the years. Finally, after a long pause, Thomas asked, "What happens if your board rejects these changes?" Xander's voice was calm, resolute. "Then I'll have a decision to make. But I've already made the most important one. These boys come first." As lunch was served, the mood lightened. The three boys talked over each other, sharing stories and inside jokes that Xander was slowly beginning to understand. He couldn't help but smile as they laughed, the sound of their joy filling the air. When the meal was finished and the plates cleared, Edmund tugged at Xander's sleeve. "Dad, can you show me that constellation book you were telling me about?" "The one with the myths?" Xander asked. "It's at my apartment," Xander explained. "But I could bring it next time." Ethan's face lit up. Or you could all come see where I live." The words slipped out before Xander had fully thought them through. He glanced at Flora uncertainly. "If that's okay." Flora hesitated, then nodded, her eyes soft with approval. "I think they'd like that." An hour later, the triplets stood wide-eyed in the lobby of Xander's luxury high-rise, marveling at the doorman in his uniform and the enormous chandelier overhead. "You live here?" Brandon asked, pressing his nose against the glass wall of the elevator as they ascended to the penthouse. When the doors opened to reveal Xander's apartment, a space with floor-to-ceiling windows that gave a panoramic view of the city, both Flora and the boys gasped. The apartment was pristine, minimalist, and unmistakably cold, like it hadn't been touched by life. It was impressive, but it felt distant. "It's like a spaceship," Calsun remarked, running his finger along the sleek countertop. Xander felt the unfamiliar weight of his surroundings, the empty space where his life had yet to truly settle. But for the first time in years, it didn't matter. What mattered now was the laughter of the boys and the steady, warm presence of Flora by his side. He had a long way to go, but the journey had already begun. Xander looked around his penthouse, suddenly feeling it through the eyes of the boys who were exploring every corner with wide-eyed wonder. "It's not very cozy," he admitted, but then added, "The view is nice at sunset." The boys, full of energy, moved about the apartment, but Flora lingered near a side table. It was where Xander had placed 3 empty photo frames, frames he had ordered with a quiet hope in mind. He hesitated before speaking, his voice soft. "I was hoping, maybe I could have some pictures of them for here, and my office." Flora's smile was genuine, her touch unexpectedly warm. "I think we can arrange that." Later, as the sun began to set over Boston Harbor, casting a golden glow on everything around them, the boys pressed themselves against the windows, their faces lit with wonder. Flora, standing beside Xander, couldn't help but laugh softly. "This is the first time they've been quiet all day," she observed, her tone filled with a kind of disbelief. Xander turned to her, his heart unexpectedly racing as he saw her in that moment, bathed in the soft light. "Thank you for today, Flora," he said quietly, his voice holding a weight of sincerity. "For letting me into their lives, into your life." For a brief moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Xander wasn't sure what it was exactly, maybe it was just the weight of everything that had happened, or maybe it was something deeper. For the first time in a long while, he thought he saw something in her gaze that wasn't just about co-parenting or courtesy. There was something there that felt like a whisper from the past and a hint of a future he hadn't even dared to imagine. But before he could process it further, Brandon's voice broke through the quiet. "Look! A helicopter," he shouted, pressing his nose against the glass. The moment shattered, but Xander couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between him and Flora. As the night unfolded, Xander showed the boys his telescope. They took turns peering through it at the emerging stars, and for the first time in his life, Xander felt something that was new to him: contentment. He had spent so many years building this life, this empire, but in this moment, in this apartment, with these boys, he felt a sense of peace. For the first time, his lavish penthouse felt like it could one day be something more. It felt like it could be a home. Monday morning arrived with a weight Xander hadn't felt in a long time. It was the kind of tension he'd only experienced before major acquisitions, before crucial decisions. As he stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie, his phone buzzed with a message from Flora: "Good luck today. The boys made you something." Attached was a photo of 3 handmade cards, each decorated with crayon drawings: Brandon's rocket ship, Ethan's stars and planets, and Coulson's surprisingly detailed grand piano. Each card was signed in wobbly letters: "Good luck, Dad." Xander's throat tightened, and without thinking, he saved the photo as his phone's background. The small, heartfelt gesture reminded him of what was truly at stake today. When he walked into the Brandy Innovations boardroom, the silence hit him like a physical force. 14 pairs of eyes turned toward him, each face a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and, for some, quiet judgment. Victoria, his COO, gave him an encouraging nod, but it wasn't enough to chase the unease in the air. "Ladies and gentlemen," Xander began, his voice steady, "thank you for convening on short notice. I've called this meeting to propose a fundamental shift in our corporate structure and philosophy." For the next 30 minutes, Xander spoke with the same confidence that had built his empire. He presented charts that showed productivity increases in companies with family-friendly policies. He shared architectural renderings of his revolutionary campus concept, and financial projections that demonstrated the long-term benefits, even if they would be costly in the short run. When he finished, Richard, the board chairman, cleared his throat. "This is ambitious, Xander," he said, the words heavy with doubt. "But what about the Singapore deal? Mr. Tun has expressed concerns about your recent distractions." "I spoke with Mr. Tun this morning," Xander replied smoothly, though the conversation had been anything but smooth. "He's intrigued by our new direction. In fact, he's requested to visit the proposed campus site next month." It wasn't entirely true. The conversation with Mr. Tun had been far more contentious, but Xander had years of negotiation experience, and he knew how to steer things in his favor. The discussion that followed was intense. Board members raised valid concerns about costs, implementation challenges, and shareholder reactions. But Xander, undeterred, addressed each point methodically, his resolve unwavering. Finally, Diane, a longtime board member, asked the question hanging in the air. "Bottom line," she said, her voice stern. "Why this drastic change now?" Xander paused, his mind quickly calculating how best to answer. He could give the politically safe response, the corporate answer, but instead, he decided to be honest. 3 weeks ago, I discovered I have 3 6-year-old sons I never knew existed. Boys I've missed watching grow up because I was too focused on building this company instead." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Xander's words hung in the air like a weight, heavy and undeniable. "I'm not asking permission to be their father," Xander continued, his voice firm. "That's non-negotiable. I'm proposing a way for Brandy Innovations to lead a corporate revolution, one that recognizes our employees as whole people, with families and lives beyond these walls." The meeting ended without a clear resolution, and the board agreed to reconvene on Friday to vote after reviewing Xander's proposal in detail. As the executives filed out of the room, Victoria lingered behind, her expression thoughtful. "Bold move," she remarked. "Bringing your personal situation into it." "It's not just personal anymore," Xander replied quietly. "It's about what kind of company I want to build. What kind of man I want to be." His phone rang as he made his way back to his office. It was Flora. His heart skipped a beat as he answered. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. "They're deliberating. Votes on Friday," Xander replied, trying to sound calm. Then, sensing the tension in her voice, he added, "Is everything okay?" Her voice shifted, worry creeping in. "It's Cal's son. The school nurse called. His asthma is flaring up badly. I'm taking him to the hospital now." Xander's heart plummeted. "Which hospital?" "Mass General Pediatric Emergency." Without a second thought, Xander's mind was already racing, his body moving before he even had a chance to fully process the situation. "I'll meet you there," he said, the words coming out with urgency. "Cancel my meetings. I'm on my way." 30 minutes later, Xander rushed into the pediatric waiting area, his eyes scanning the room frantically until they landed on Flora. She looked pale, her eyes wide with worry, but she was holding it together, barely. Xander's heart ached as he moved toward her, his mind racing with all the possibilities, none of them good. Xander burst into the hospital waiting room, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His eyes immediately found Flora, sitting beside their sons, Brandon and Ethan. The usual spark of energy in the boys was absent, replaced with a heavy quiet that matched the fear hanging in the air. "Where is he?" Xander asked urgently, panic creeping into his voice. "With the doctors," Flora answered, her voice tight. "They're giving him breathing treatments. They said his oxygen levels were concerning." Xander felt a sharp pain twist in his chest. He sank into the chair next to Flora, his hand instinctively reaching out to hers. She didn't pull away. "He was fine this morning," Flora said, her voice breaking as the fear in her heart spilled over. Then, during recess, her words trailed off as the weight of the situation settled between them. Xander squeezed her hand gently. "He'll be okay," he reassured her, though doubt lingered in his own heart. Kids with asthma bounce back quickly. Time seemed to stretch in the sterile, lifeless waiting room. Xander's phone buzzed incessantly with messages. Singapore. The board. Victoria. His stomach tightened with each vibration, but he ignored them all, his focus fixed on the double doors. Each second felt like a lifetime as he waited for any news about Cal's son. Then, the doors finally opened. A doctor stepped through, and Xander and Flora both sprang to their feet. The doctor's face held no immediate signs of alarm, which was a small relief. "Coulson's responding well to treatment," she assured them, her tone steady. "We'd like to keep him overnight for observation, but he's stable now." The weight that had been pressing on Xander's chest lifted slightly. The relief that flooded him was nothing like the satisfaction of closing a big deal or securing a new partnership. This was different, more profound, more real. It was the relief of knowing his son was going to be okay. But before Xander could even speak, his phone buzzed again, this time from Richard, the board chairman. Xander sighed, a heavy sound, before stepping into the hallway to take the call. "This better be important," Xander said, his voice sharp with frustration. "Important? You've been completely unreachable for 18 hours, Xander," Richard's voice came through the line, cold and demanding. "The Singapore team is threatening to pull out entirely, and the board vote has been moved up to today instead of Friday." Xander's stomach clenched. "Today? That's not what we agreed to." "Things change," Richard replied, his voice ice cold. "Your absence yesterday sent a concerning message. The meeting is at noon. If you're not there, I can't guarantee the outcome will favor your new direction." The threat was clear. Xander clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to lash out. He glanced down at his watch. It was 9:17 a.m. The doctor had said Cal's son might be discharged by mid-morning. "I'll be there," Xander said, his voice tight with resolve. "But Richard, if you pull something like this again, you'll be looking for a new CEO, regardless of the vote." He ended the call and returned to the hospital room, where Flora was helping Cal's son with his breakfast. Her eyes met his, reading his expression. "Work crisis," Xander said, his tone grim. Flora didn't look surprised. She had seen this side of him before. "The board vote got moved to noon today," he explained. "I need to be there." A shadow crossed Flora's face, a flicker of disappointment, but she didn't argue. "It's okay," she said quietly. "We'll manage here." "No," Xander replied, his voice firm. "I'm staying until Coulson's discharged. I just need to be at that meeting by noon." At 10:30 a.m., the doctor returned, reviewing Coulson's vitals. "You're looking much better today, young man," she said with a reassuring smile. "I think we can send you home, but you'll need to take it easy for a few days." Xander's phone buzzed again, this time with urgent messages from Victoria and his lawyers. But for a moment, he didn't care. His son was going to be okay. By 11:15 a.m., they were leaving the hospital. Cal's son was moving slowly but steadily between his parents, looking pale but alert. Xander checked his watch again. He could still make the meeting if he went directly to the office. Flora, sensing what was running through his mind, spoke before he could. "The meeting," she said quietly. "I know. You need to go," she continued, resigned but understanding. "It's important." Xander looked at Coulson's pale face, then glanced at his watch once more. The weight of his company's future was hanging in the balance, but something inside him had shifted. A month ago, the choice would have been simple. His company came first, always. But now, his priorities had changed. "No," he said firmly. "I'm coming home with you and Cal's son." Flora's eyes widened in surprise. "But your board vote can happen without me," Xander finished for her. "I've made my proposal. Now, they can decide what kind of company they want to be." He quickly called Victoria. "I won't be at the meeting," he said, his tone final. "Coulson's health comes first. Present my proposal as planned and let me know the outcome." The ride home was quiet. Cal's son, drowsy from the medication, rested in his seat. Flora occasionally stole glances at Xander, but neither of them said much. The silence was thick with the weight of everything that had changed in the past few days. When they arrived home, Xander carefully carried Cal's son to bed, settling him in for a much-needed rest. Then he joined Flora in the kitchen. She was standing there, waiting for him, her expression unreadable. "Why?" she asked simply, her voice soft but full of quiet curiosity. Xander let out a deep breath. "Because 6 years ago, I made the wrong choice," he said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. "I chose ambition over love, and it cost me everything that actually mattered." He met her eyes. "I won't make that mistake again." Before Flora could respond, Xander's phone rang. It was Victoria, calling from the boardroom. "You're on speaker," Victoria announced. "The board has questions about your campus proposal before voting." Xander didn't hesitate. "Perfect timing," he said, motioning for Flora to listen in. "I'd like to revise my proposal." Richard's voice came through the phone, sounding alarmed. "Revise?" "Yes," Xander said confidently. "I initially presented this as a business strategy. Improved retention. Productivity benefits. Positive PR. But that's not why we should do this." He paused, catching Flora's eye. The weight of his words was heavier now than it had ever been before. "We should do this because it's right. Because our employees deserve to be present for soccer games and piano recitals. Because no quarterly report is worth missing your child's first steps or their 6th birthday." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "That's a lovely sentiment," Richard finally replied, his voice flat. "But sentiment doesn't drive shareholder value." "Doesn't it?" Xander challenged, his voice steady. What if Brandy Innovations could be the company that chooses people over profits? Brandy Innovations had become the first major tech company to truly put families first, not just with empty promises, but with groundbreaking infrastructure that would forever change the way businesses operated. Xander's idea wasn't just to attract top talent, it was to create loyalty that money could never buy. Flora's hand found Xander's across the table, squeezing it gently. The tension in the room had been thick, but now, there was a sense of relief. After a long silence, Victoria's voice broke through the stillness, announcing, "The vote stands at 7 in favor, 6 opposed, 1 abstaining. Motion carried." As the call ended, Xander let out a long, slow breath. The weight he'd been carrying for weeks lifted, if only for a moment. "What happens now?" Flora asked softly, her voice filled with curiosity and a hint of concern. "Now," Xander said, his smile wide and genuine, "we build something revolutionary." On the kitchen table in front of them were the architectural renderings, plans for a sprawling campus, unlike anything corporate America had ever seen. There were modern office buildings surrounding a central green space, with a state-of-the-art childcare facility, an elementary school, and a family recreation center, all designed with families in mind. "What do you think?" Xander asked, the nervous energy he'd been carrying evident in his voice as he watched Flora study the plans. "It's incredible," Flora said, tracing the outline of the playground with her finger. But then, she hesitated. "But Xander, the cost must be astronomical." "Worth every penny," Xander replied without a second thought. "We've secured the land in Newton. It's close enough to the city but offers plenty of space. Construction could begin next month." Flora shook her head in amazement. "You've certainly created waves. I saw an article about you in the business section yesterday. Billionaire CEO revolutionizes work-life balance." Xander grimaced. "The publicity wasn't my goal." "Maybe not," Flora agreed, "but people are paying attention. My supervisor even asked if your company is hiring. Apparently, parents with professional experience are updating their resumes in droves." Before Xander could respond, their sons burst through the door, coming back from an outing with their grandparents, who had extended their visit after seeing the positive changes in Coulson's life. "Dad," Brandon exclaimed, eyes wide with excitement. "Grandpa took us fishing. I caught 2. Thomas, following behind, offered a nod of approval. His initial hostility toward Xander had softened over the past few weeks as he'd observed Xander's dedication to his children. "You've created quite a stir in the business world," Thomas said, looking at the campus plans on the table. "My colleagues can't stop talking about it." "It's still tentative," Xander warned, his voice cautious. "Not everyone's on board." As if on cue, Xander's phone rang. It was his CFO, and the panic in her voice was unmistakable. Material costs were soaring, and investors were growing restless, questioning the ambitious timeline. "I need to take this," Xander muttered, excusing himself as he stepped into the hallway. The call confirmed what Xander had feared. Key investors were threatening to withdraw their support. They were concerned about the project's scale and the potential return on investment. When Xander returned to the kitchen, his expression was troubled, and Flora noticed immediately. "Pros?" she asked, her voice quiet, as the boys excitedly showed their grandfather the campus designs. "Nothing I can't handle," Xander assured her, though there was uncertainty in his eyes. "Just some investors getting cold feet." Flora studied him carefully. "Is the project in jeopardy?" "No," Xander said firmly, though doubt flickered behind his confident words. "I'll make this happen. Whatever it takes." Later, as Xander prepared to leave, Flora walked him to his car. "You know," she said, her voice hesitant, "what you're doing, it's changing more than just your company. It's changing them." She nodded toward the house, where the boys played inside. "And it's changing you." Her words hit him harder than he expected. She was right. The driven CEO who had returned to Boston weeks ago was no longer the same person. He was becoming someone else, someone who valued success not by the numbers on a spreadsheet but by the smiles of his children. For the better, I hope, he asked suddenly, feeling vulnerable. Flora's smile was warm, more genuine than anything he'd seen in years. Definitely for the better, she said softly. As Xander drove away, he made a silent promise to himself and to his sons. No matter what obstacles came their way, this vision would become a reality. Not for his legacy, not for the company's bottom line, but for his 3 little boys who deserved a father who put what truly mattered first. The following morning, tensions were running high at Brandy Innovations headquarters. The headlines were devastating. Singapore investors pull out of Brandy family campus project. The groundbreaking vision that had energized employees and captured the media's attention now hung by a thread. Xander paced his office, phone pressed to his ear. We can secure alternative funding, he insisted to his increasingly panicked CFO. The project will proceed as planned. He ended the call with a heavy sigh, checking his watch. It was 3:15 p.m. Ethan's chess tournament final started at 4 p.m. across town. At the same time, the board had called an emergency meeting to discuss the project's future. Xander knew he had a decision to make. The phone call came at the worst possible time. Victoria knocked on Xander's office door, her voice anxious. Xander, everyone's gathering in the boardroom. They're expecting a detailed contingency plan from you. Xander was distracted, staring down at the chessboard on his desk, a gift from Ethan, who had spent hours practicing for his tournament later that day. Edmund had asked him this morning, voice full of uncertainty, "You'll be there, right, Dad?" But Xander had already made up his mind. "I'm not attending the board meeting," he said, casually removing his tie. Victoria froze, blinking in confusion. "What?" "Xander, the entire project is at risk. Without Singapore's backing, everything is on the line." "I know," Xander replied, cutting her off, his voice calm but firm. He grabbed his keys from the desk. "But my son has a chess tournament final at 4, and I promised I'd be there." Victoria's disbelief was clear. "You're choosing a children's chess game over a crisis that could decide your company's future?" Xander didn't flinch. A strange calm washed over him. "I'm not choosing one over the other. I'm prioritizing correctly, maybe for the first time in my life." He handed her a folder filled with documents. "These are my contingency proposals. Present them to the board. I've included options for scaled implementation, alternative investor approaches, and a potential private funding structure. And if they want me there? They'll have to wait until after I've watched my son play chess." The middle school gymnasium buzzed with nervous energy as Xander arrived. He spotted Flora, already saving him a seat in the front row. Surprise flashed across her face when she saw him. "You made it," she whispered as he sat beside her, eyes scanning the room. "I thought with the Singapore news." Xander leaned in, his voice low. "There's an emergency board meeting happening right now. Without me." Flora's eyes widened, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she watched Edmund at the tournament table, anxiously scanning the crowd. The moment their eyes met, Ethan's face lit up. A smile of pure relief spread across his face, and he proudly pointed at Xander, showing him off to his chess coach. "That's my dad," Edmund said aloud. Brandon and Calsun, initially restless, were now glued to the game. Edmund was in his element, methodically advancing through the tournament brackets. The gymnasium grew quieter as the final round approached. His opponent, an older boy from a prestigious private school, was clearly a tough challenge. Xander's phone buzzed again, non-stop. Board members, investors, lawyers, everyone demanding his attention. But Xander didn't even look at it. His focus was entirely on Ethan, whose brow was furrowed as he carefully considered his next move. The final game stretched on for nearly an hour. The crowd watched in suspense as Ethan, with a calm and calculated move, sacrificed his queen, leading to a stunning checkmate. The room erupted into applause. Xander jumped to his feet, cheering, as Edmund pumped his fist in victory. The applause continued as Edmund made his way to the stage to receive his trophy. Nervously, he approached the microphone. "I want to thank my coach," he said, his voice shy. Then he paused and looked at Xander. "And my dad. He taught me that sometimes, you have to sacrifice something important to win in the end." Tears pricked Xander's eyes as he applauded, his heart swelling with pride. Ethan's words, simple yet profound, hit him harder than anything else. Perhaps, like his son, Xander needed to make a sacrifice to win in the end, only his sacrifice was bigger than a game. It was a shift in how he measured success. Edmund ran into Xander's arms, trophy tightly clutched in his hands. "I wouldn't have missed this for anything in the world," Xander whispered fiercely, hugging his son tightly. Only then did he remember his phone. 17 missed calls. One text from Victoria, board voted 8-5. Project proceeds with modifications. "You were right." Xander smiled, pocketing the phone without responding. The business crisis could wait until tomorrow. This moment, his son's triumph, the joy on his kids' faces, Flora's hand in his, this was irreplaceable. In choosing Ethan's chess tournament over an emergency board meeting, Xander Brandy had finally reordered his priorities. And somehow, both his personal and professional worlds were better for it. 6 months later, Xander stood proudly in front of the gleaming new sign. Brandy Family Innovation Campus. His 3 excited sons fidgeted in their little suits, waiting to cut the ceremonial ribbon. "Ready?" Xander asked, handing Calson the oversized scissors they would share. The crowd of employees, investors, media, and local families cheered as the Brandy triplets snipped the ribbon to thunderous applause. The revolutionary campus had finally become a reality, though not without sacrifice. Xander had poured much of his personal fortune into the project when funding gaps appeared. The sleek, minimalist penthouse had been sold. In its place, he had bought a cozy home just minutes away from both the new campus and Flora's house. As visitors toured the new facility, exploring the modern offices alongside the state-of-the-art child care center, elementary school, and family recreation spaces, Xander slipped away to find Flora. She was standing near the playground, watching families explore what would soon be their new community. "It's really happening," she said softly as he approached, pride in her voice. "I'm proud of you." "I couldn't have done it without you," Xander replied, taking her hand. Their relationship had grown over the past months, gradually shifting from friendship to something more, all while they co-parented their sons together. "Dad," Brandon called out, racing toward them with Calson and Edmund at his heels. "Can we show Grandma and Grandpa the science lab now?" Thomas and Ellen Thomas, now fully supportive of Xander's role in their daughter's life, smiled indulgently from a nearby bench. "Of course," Xander laughed, watching his sons dash off excitedly. He turned back to Flora, squeezing her hand. "I used to think success meant bigger profits and more power. Now I know it's about this: family, purpose, balance." Flora smiled, reaching up to adjust his tie affectionately. "You've built something remarkable here." "No," Xander corrected gently, pulling her close. "We're building it together." As they rejoined their family, Xander, once defined solely by his business achievements, felt truly successful for the first time. The campus around them wasn't just a corporate innovation, it was a physical manifestation of his transformed priorities, a promise kept to 3 little boys who had changed everything. The journey from that chance encounter outside Walmart to this moment had been full of challenges and imperfections. But as Xander watched his sons race ahead, eager for the future, he knew he was finally heading in the right direction. Xander Brandy, a billionaire CEO, was once consumed by work, but everything changed when he saw his ex-girlfriend, Flora, waiting for an Uber with their 3 sons. Realizing he had missed out on so much, he chose to prioritize his family over his company. Despite facing backlash, he pushed through and built a revolutionary family-focused campus for his employees. In the end, Xander found true success not in profits, but in being there for his children. When he cut the ribbon with his sons by his side, Xander knew he'd finally made the right choice. What did you think of Xander's journey? Rate the story and drop a comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more.